Good evening and welcome to True Talk. This is your host Samar Jarrah. My co-host is in town but under the weather just like myself. Thank you for joining True Talk on WMNF 88.5 FM. Today we have a very interesting show. We're going to be talking with Dr. Zachary Foster, and Dr. Foster has a PhD from Princeton University, and he is really maybe the well-versed historian on Palestine. And we are also transmitting live on my Twitter account. If you go to Samar, SAMAR, the letter D, and then JARRAH, you can listen and see myself and Zachary. And we're going to be having a very interesting show. Excuse my voice and the interruptions because of the cold that I have. But if you have any questions during this conversation with Dr. Foster, just send them to dj@wmnf.org, to dj@wmnf.org. Good morning, Dr. Foster. Good to have you on True Talk.
Thanks so much for having me.
I've been following you for, I don't know, maybe a year or two, and I was always curious about your background because you do write very interesting threads, and for those who are listening, like Twitter allows you a certain space to be able to express yourself. So then you write another block and another block, and they're always very interesting. A lot of history, a lot of maps, and you do also have, I think, a website that you can refer to in a short while. But I was always curious, how did you become interested in Palestine, and was your PhD related to Palestine?
Yeah, so I grew up in a Jewish environment, going to Jewish schools, Jewish summer camps, Jewish youth groups, and that got me interested in Israel and Zionism. And the more I learned about Israel and Zionism, the more I studied the history of the Zionist movement, the more horrified I became. The more horror I felt, because the Zionists struggled with a basic problem, which was how do you create a Jewish state in a land that's 95% non-Jewish? That was a problem, and so that was sort of the starting point for me. And that got me interested in studying history deeper. I learned Arabic, and I wrote my PhD dissertation on the origins of a Palestinian identity. Who were the first people to call themselves Palestinians? And why did they start calling themselves Palestinians? And then also the history and the usage of the word Philistine, Palestine, in the Arabic language and other languages. When did people use that term in history? And why did they use it in history? And did they feel any connection to it in history? So those were the questions I tried to answer in my dissertation.
Interesting. I'm curious to know when did the term Philistine, which is used in the English language, was used? Because I'm not sure if you know or not, but I am Palestinian. Both my parents and actually my husband, all of them were born in Palestine, but not me. I was born in Kuwait because my parents became refugees in 1948.
Yes, I'm familiar somewhat with the Palestinian diaspora. I mean, you have Palestinians basically in every country in the world, for the same reason, by the way, that you have Jews almost in every country in the world. When you have a violent expulsion, when 75% of your people are expelled by force and then not allowed to return, you have these diaspora communities everywhere. So it's a pleasure to learn that about you, Samar. I didn't know that.
Yes, I am Palestinian. So when was the word Palestine or Palestini or Philistine actually used, historically speaking?
Yeah, so the first usage of the term Philistini to refer to an Arabic speaker from Palestine appears in the 10th century, so more than 1,000 years ago. A guy by the name of Al-Maqdisi or Al-Muqaddisi. He publishes a book in the 10th century called Ahsan al-Taqasim fi Ma'rifat al-Aqalim. And this book, in the book, it's a travel log. It's a geographical treatise in which he travels to Iran, and he's asked by someone in Iran, "Where are you from?" He says, "I'm Palestinian." But then you have a period of about 1,000 years, let's call it 800-900 years, where there doesn't seem to be very many people calling themselves Palestinians. But in the late 19th century, you start to see the term appear in Western sources, in English and German, in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s. And then the first Palestinian to use that term, Falastini or Falastiniyin in Arabic, as far as I'm aware, is Khalil Bedas, Palestinian from the north. I believe he's from the Jalil, and maybe he's from Nasra. He may be from Nazareth, and he translates a book from Russian to Arabic. It's basically a travel guide to the Holy Land, and in that book he refers to the Arabic-speaking inhabitants of Palestine. He refers to them as a Palestinian. And then you get Najib Nassar, who is from Haifa, and he uses that term in an article he publishes in 1901. Actually, the title of the article is "A Palestinian Describes a Palestinian Town." Falastini Yusufaha Buldan Falastini, or something like that. And and then you get Salim Qabain also used the term in 1901. And then by the year 1914, you have something like 120 references to those two words, Falastini, and it's plural, Falastiniyin. You have something like 120 references to those two terms in Arabic texts, journals, newspapers, magazines, books by 1914.
As you know, of course, from your studies, Dr. Foster, that, I have an accent. If I speak in Arabic, you will immediately know I am Palestinian, and you might even detect where I am from. Although my father is from Lid, from north, and they speak with al-kasra, يعني they say نقول خبزة, but my mom grew up in Gaza, so I say khubza. So I am like you can actually know which part of Palestine I am from because of my dialect and from the way I speak my Palestinian language. So is this, so what I'm trying to say, we have, even in Gaza, we have a special food like al-maftul, but في Nablus, a little bit towards the east and towards the West Bank, they have al-maqluba, مثلا. And even if we do maqluba in the north, it's different than the one in the south or the east or in between. So we do have a unique culture and heritage. Is that why in the narrative, in the Zionist narrative, in even the Western narrative, they like to say the Arabs in the West Bank, the Arabs in Palestine, even referring to the Israeli citizens who are Palestinian but live in the state of Israel, the borders of 1948. Is that an attempt to erase this identity that you studied and found that it has been always there in the Palestinian narrative and history?
Thank you so much for asking that question, Samar, because it's something we've been witnessing not for a few decades, but for more than a century. You have Zionist writers already in the 1930s basically saying they call themselves Arabs, not Palestinians, that the place was called Southern Syria, not Palestine. So that's a trope and a narrative that we've been hearing for almost a century. And the reason is pretty obvious, right? You don't have groups of people telling you there are no such thing as Egyptians or Syrians or Lebanese or Iraqis, right? There's no one challenging those identities, but there are a lot of people challenging the Palestinian identity, and that's because of Zionism, because Zionists claim Israel as a Jewish homeland, and so wouldn't it be great, if these people didn't exist in the first place, right? That's sort of the starting point is, gosh, wouldn't it be so wonderful? Wouldn't it be just so much easier to establish a Jewish state? Wouldn't it be, there would be so much less friction. We wouldn't have to worry about confiscating land. It would just be available for us in the first place. So this has been kind of the refrain of the Zionist movement for almost a century, right? Or if not more. We don't want these people here. If they're here, they're Arabs, they're not Palestinians. If they're here, they should call the place Israel, not Palestine. If they're here, they should wave an Israeli flag, not a Palestinian flag. This is the essence of the Zionist movement.
Or for instance, like when this was so sometimes done so naively and really without any evil intent by so many people on Twitter. Maybe you have seen them, Zakaria. But for instance, when Gaza, the bombing of Gaza started and people started to realize that this is going to go for more than just a day or two, and when they saw the images of refugees or people fleeing, they said, why Egypt is not allowing them to go to the Sinai? The Arabs are not letting the Arabs to go there, as if it's an Arab issue. And here on the radio station, I used to have a caller who would say, why don't you just live in Jordan? You're an Arab. Why don't you just live in Saudi Arabia? And I would say, why don't you just go and live in New Zealand? They speak English. Why don't you just go to Canada? Why don't you just go to Britain? But really, I wanted now to shift gears. I know I am a little bit overstepping, but because I want to stay with this narrative. When there was a bomb or a rocket that went off in the occupied Golan Heights, the same narrative, the same language was used. People assumed these were Israeli children. But there was no a little bit in-depth analysis of this is occupied land. Those are Syrians from a sect called the Druze. And they live under occupation. And when the Prime Minister of Israel came to visit them, they kicked him out. Can you address the Golan Heights in the spectrum of this language that we are talking about? Like, who are these people? And then we're going to go to the most recent events of yesterday and the day before.
So Israel occupied the Golan Heights from Syria in 1967, at the same time that it occupied Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Sinai Peninsula. And then in 1981, Israel annexed the Golan Heights. It's obviously an illegal annexation. You cannot annex territory you conquered in war. That violates the basic principles of international law, the Geneva Conventions of 1948-49. And that's why the entire world, save for the United States, acknowledges that this is occupied territory and it must be returned to Syria. And so the people, and then you have, many tens of thousands of Druze and others living in the Golan Heights who do not recognize the Israeli occupation, who do not take Israeli citizenship, who do not have Israeli passports. And so when you have an Israeli prime minister going to visit the Golan Heights after this tragedy, claiming, basically, I would say, exploiting the death of these children for the purposes of warmongering and escalation and more violence and more death, it's absolutely horrifying and disgusting. And that's why he was unwelcome. And so I think, and on top of that, you have the Druze, a population that is divided in 4, 5, 6 states. Stateless people who do not have political rights, who and so look, I think I think what we saw is at the same time we saw in Gaza the same day that 12 Jewish children were killed in Golan Heights. We had more than 50 people die in the same day in Gaza, and just a day earlier you had no outrage. And so why is it that when children inside Israel, I mean, we know this is occupied territory, but nevertheless the perception in the media was that this was a strike on Israel. You have every U.S. congressperson, every senator, claiming there's a double standard, when in fact, on the same day that they're claiming there's a double standard, they're completely ignoring the deaths of dozens, if not, 5 to 10 times as many children dying on the same day in Gaza.
Foster, Dr. Foster, the people on Twitter sometimes in the Arabic language, they see these things and I usually translate it into Arabic, like what they say into Arabic, so they know, they get a feel of what is being said there. And they ask me, are they that biased or are they that ignorant in history and geography? What do you think? Is it a mix of two?
There's definitely ignorance. I think that you had, was it Chris Cuomo, the former CNN anchor, have this 8-minute rant about how first he calls them Israeli children, he calls Syrian he calls the Golan Heights Israeli territory multiple times in the broadcast. Right, this is a very he has 5 million followers on Twitter, whatever it is, and he's just spewing misinformation. So clearly the guy is just ignorant. I don't expect him to know that necessarily the political status of the Golan Heights, but just sit down and be quiet and listen rather than speak. So there's definitely ignorance going on, but there's also willful misinformation being spread. I mean, how many headlines has the New York Times published where it's 12 children die in a strike? Well, who launched the strike? Did they die or were they murdered? It's just so there's clearly a ton of willful misinformation being spread, but there's also a ton of ignorance as well.
Let me just remind our listeners, this is True Talk on WMNF 88.5 FM, and I'm talking to Dr. Zachary Foster. He has a PhD from Princeton University, and he's a historian on Palestine. He is of Jewish origin, and as he said in the beginning, he was a supporter of Zionism, and the more he studied, the more he realized there is another side to the story of Palestine and Israel. And if you have any emails, please send them to dj@wmnf.org, dj@wmnf.org. And those who are listening online, you can send the chat through my Twitter account, and I'll be checking it from time to time. Dr. Foster, 2 days ago, the former Prime Minister of Gaza, or the Palestinian people, or the Palestinian Authority, who was democratically elected in an election that was monitored by international bodies, but including Jimmy Carter, the former president of the United States of America, was assassinated while on a visit to Tehran. Of course, nobody mentions who Ismail Haniyeh, like what kind of a job he had. Actually, I want to read to you the headline from the New York Times. It says, Ismail Haniyeh, a top leader of Hamas, died at 62. So I was wondering, was he swimming and drowned? Or did he slip in the bathroom and hit his head and went into a coma? Like, what kind of a headline is that? Can you, you don't even have to address that, but it just crossed my mind because you said, the way our media confuses people and leads them to different way of thinking. But can you tell our listeners who was Ismail Haniyeh and what happened?
Ismail Haniyeh was the head of the political bureau of Hamas. Hamas is a political organization. It has a military wing. It operates charities and schools and mosques. So Ismail Haniyeh is the political chief, living in exile. He has spent a lot of time in Qatar, in Turkey, in Iran. So he is going around to these. He's been in China recently. And so to see him be assassinated by Israel is quite honestly shocking, remarkable. It's not shocking, but it's remarkable because he lives his life out in the open, right? So there's a very brazen assassination attempt in Iran, on Iranian soil of all places. And so you have to ask yourself, what is Israel thinking here? Let's just talk about what could be the possible strategic reason here. Israel has assassinated many Hamas leaders before. This is sort of long-standing Israeli policy. In 2004, Israel, I believe it was March 2004, Israel assassinated the founder of Hamas, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. A month later, they assassinated Abdulaziz Rantisi, who was then, at the time, I think the Hamas leader, because he had taken over after Yassin's assassination. Then they tried to assassinate Khalid Mash'al multiple times, and it was one very embarrassing case where they assassinated him, and then it was discovered, and he was literally on his deathbed when Jordan said, "You either give us the antidote to the poison that you provided him, or there will be consequences." And Israel provided the antidote, and he survived. And he's now and there's discussions now that he will take over. But the question is, what does this achieve? What happened after 2004, after Israel assassinated the number one and the number two in Hamas? Well, Hamas got stronger. They built more weapons factories underground. They then took over the Gaza Strip, right? In the aftermath of the Yassin and Abdulaziz Rantisi assassinations, Hamas emerged as, for the first time in its history, as the most popular political movement in Palestine. Right? Of course, they're going to emerge as the most popular movement in Palestine. When you martyr the leaders, when you assassinate them in cold blood, what happens? You're only driving more support and more sympathy for the movement, and that is exactly what is going to happen again. This is not about trying to reduce Hamas's military capabilities. If anything, what the clear and obvious reason behind this assassination was to kill the truce talks, was to kill the ceasefire discussion.
Because he's responsible for the ceasefire talks. Is it correct?
That's exactly right. He was one of the, if not the primary Hamas official negotiating the November 6-week ceasefire, or was it 2-week ceasefire? He was the primary negotiator, and he's been the one going back and forth between the Hamas leadership in Gaza and the Israelis, via Turkey, via Qatar, via Egypt. He is the primary political negotiator. So, nothing screams, we want a ceasefire, quite like assassinating the person on the other side negotiating the ceasefire.
My gosh. So, what is there any reaction on the side of the families of the hostages or the prisoners held in Gaza? If the whole time they're pushing Netanyahu to strike a deal with Hamas, now they go and assassinate the very guy who is leading the negotiations to have a ceasefire or to release the hostages. So, is there any reaction from their side?
There have already been protests. I think the average Israeli is still of the mindset of, wow, somehow by killing Hamas's leader, we're somehow going to be more safe. I think there's still this mentality of revenge and bravado and militarism and toxicity. That is the average Israeli's opinion. But of course, for the families of the hostages who have been protesting in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, every single day for 300 days, it's absolutely horrifying for them, and they've only ramped up their protests. So this is not going to turn out the way Bibi Netanyahu hopes. There will be more protests, there will be more opposition, because the chances of a ceasefire deal and a return to the hostages are even more distant than they ever have been.
Some people say, and I'm not sure if you agree or not, that this was a kind of a way for him to say, hey, see, we got actually two people. They got somebody in Lebanon, belongs to Hezbollah, and then he got Ismail Haniyeh, a very prominent Hamas leader. So, okay, we'll declare victory and leave, and maybe now start new negotiations. Do you think that he just needed something to express that they have won somehow? Because 300 years for a nuclear capable country not being able to finish off a bunch of they're wearing slippers. Some of these Hamas fighters are wearing slippers, and some of them don't even have shoes on or slippers on, and they have hardly anything to wear or to eat. So how could this very sophisticated army not beat these people? So is he trying to find an exit strategy by assassinating Ismail Haniyeh?
It's very strange. I think on the one hand, Netanyahu has no interest in a ceasefire or a return of the hostages. That will require a cessation of Israeli hostilities in the Gaza Strip, which will bring down his coalition, which will lead him to his trials for corruption, bribery, and breach of public trust to renew, and thus he will likely wind up in prison. So I think for Netanyahu, the choices are, I continue the war or I go to prison. So anything that will increase the chances of more war is something that Netanyahu is going to be behind. And so, yes, when you kill the number 2 Hezbollah commander in Beirut, in Lebanon, when you kill Hamas's number 1 political figure in Iran, when you bomb Yemen, when you attack the Iranian embassy in Syria, right? This is all part of the same strategy. You're trying to you're desperate for more war. You're trying to open up another front.
But isn't this dangerous to American interests in the region? Because we do have an election going on, and it's hardly even going on smoothly with Biden getting out of the Democratic ticket. Who wants to be involved with a regional war in the Arab world, with the oil supplies, with the Suez Canal, with the trade routes? I mean, is he like, and let's forget about the US and the Arab world. What about people inside Israel? I mean, they're all blinded by his lust for power and not going to court. I mean, isn't there any kind of opposition in this so-called democracy?
Unfortunately, support for the war is still strong. There may be a desire to get rid of Netanyahu, but there is not a desire to stop the war in Gaza. I mean, the average Israeli is pro-war, is pro-genocide. You recall polling data in January, so this is dated now, but 95% of Jewish Israelis, as of January 2024, believed Israel was either using just the right amount of force in Gaza or not enough force. And the most recent polling data, I haven't seen more recent numbers than that, and I'm sure that the numbers have come down slightly. But there's still overwhelming support for a war in Gaza and Israel. There's this belief that you can somehow, eradicate Hamas. I mean, Israel's own intelligence rejects that claim. For months now, former Mossad chiefs have come out and said in the open, you cannot destroy Hamas. Forgetting about destroying the idea of Hamas, you can't even destroy the actual military wing in Gaza. And we've seen over and over again, in just the past week, Hamas has carried out 100 operations in Gaza against Israeli troops. On the Philadelphia corridor, they're booby-trapping homes, killing. In some cases, according to the Al-Qassam videos, it appears as if they're killing 5-10 soldiers in a single blast. These are, of course, not being reported by the Israeli military, who isn't reporting their casualty counts. But in just the past week, you have 100 operations all across the Gaza Strip. I mean, this is essentially the Israeli military approach in Gaza is for 6 months, we'll occupy Khan Yunis, we'll withdraw, Hamas fighters come back, take back over the streets. Then Israel comes back into Khan Yunis, reoccupies the street, kills more Palestinians, then leaves, and then comes back. But they've been unable to date to occupy and hold territory. They simply cannot defeat Hamas. Hamas is, regardless of what you think about their politics, Hamas is a formidable military force. So Israel, it's not even obvious Israel has weakened Hamas's military capabilities in Gaza.
We don't have any proof of that, but at the same time, if you are following Dr. Foster, and now that I know that you speak Arabic, I'm sure you know that there are women, there are unreligious people, non-religious people, Christian people from the Arab world who are now, and since the past few months, are expressing their support of Hamas, like people who would not dare even print the Hama Alif Sin when they tweet or put it on Facebook. Now they are publicly supporting of it. So it backfired. Now Hamas is popular outside the Palestinians. Did you feel that and sense that? Like they made it so popular in the Arab world.
It's truly remarkable that an organization that obviously carried out war crimes on October 7th is now become the most popular Palestinian movement in the entire Arab and Muslim world. Their popularity has risen in the West Bank. Not just the movement itself, but the idea of militant resistance has never been more popular. You go around the West Bank, you have West Bank Palestinian fighters carrying out operations they've never carried out before. You have in places like Tuba, in places like Tulkarm, in places like Jenin and Nablus, you have daily military operations. These are groups that were essentially quite inactive or not very active prior to October 7th, are now carrying out not dozens, but hundreds and hundreds of military operations on Israeli soldiers and Israeli military targets in the West Bank. Not to mention Iran, not to mention Yemen. Now you have the Ansar Allah movement in Yemen, firing rockets at Israel and drones at Israel. You have Hezbollah, who's actively engaged and continues to attack Israeli military targets in the north. You have groups in Syria and Iraq attacking U.S. Soldiers in Iraq, owing to the U.S.'s complicity and support for the Israeli war in Gaza. So I think Israel's idea of using military force to try to make itself safe has backfired in every imaginable way. Israel has, I don't know if it's 10 times as many people carrying out attacks on it every day, or 100 times as many people carrying out attacks on it every day, but it is dramatically less safe today than it was on October 6th.
And this support for the Palestinian cause, you can see it reflected outside the region. In the rest of the world, you have people in Japan, you have people in Indonesia, Malaysia, you have people in France and Spain, you have people all over the world expressing their love for Palestine, for Palestinian culture, people wearing the symbols like the hatta or a flag or what is it, the thing that we eat, batikh, watermelon, because at one time the Palestinians were not allowed to wear the flag, so they wear clothing that has the red, black, white, and green. But what is happening is becoming global. Do you sense that the Palestinian cause is really going through a different phase, a more international, especially with Generation Z and the younger people, from somebody who is a historian and studied the history of Palestine for hundreds and hundreds of years? Are you witnessing a different phenomena?
Look, I've never seen anything like this before in my life. Spending time in places like Mexico, going to Germany, going to Greece, you go to these countries where there's never really had been much interest or support for Palestine. Everyone knows what's happening. Everyone is wearing a keffiyeh or wearing a watermelon, as you said. I've never seen anything like it. I was in Athens a month or two ago. You see graffiti everywhere. It's the Palestinian symbols are international symbols of justice now. You saw Euro Cup. Whenever you have soccer matches, when you have a Moroccan in the World Cup raise the Palestinian flag, you've never seen this kind of support before for the Palestinian people. It's truly unprecedented.
The $1 million question that I always get, fine, but especially here in the US, will we see any reflection of this sympathy that is growing towards the Palestinian cause reflected at the White House, reflected at the State Department? Because if you are listening to the press conference of the State Department, you really have to have a lot of stamina, a lot of cool brain cells to be able to withstand the double standard, the obvious, clear double standard of the spokespersons of the State Department when they talk about a Palestinian victim versus an Israeli victim. Will we see any reflection on foreign policy, especially now that we have, maybe a new administration coming?
Well, we've learned over the past few months that we don't actually have a president in the White House. We have a senile, demented octogenarian who can barely utter a coherent sentence. So it's sort of the deep state.
But still very supportive of the state of Israel in spite of all that.
Well, his position has remained essentially unchanged for the past 9 months, which is that we will provide Israel however many arms, however many mortar shells, however many tanks, however many 500-pound and 1,000-pound and 2,000-pound bombs it needs. That position has remained unchanged. And it appears as if it will continue to remain unchanged between now and November. Now, as far as Kamala Harris goes, she is trying to, she's trying to appease. She's trying to kind of come out. She understands that she cannot win Michigan if she just continues to be as pro-genocide as she has been. She cannot win Pennsylvania if she continues to be as pro-genocide as she has been. And she cannot win the election without Michigan or Pennsylvania. So I think she sort of is aware that she needs to change her tone, but she's still sitting in an administration that is complicit and actively supporting the genocide in Gaza. So what is she to do? She's obviously in a bind and clearly doesn't know what to do, and is trying to sort of play both sides. But I don't think it's going to work.
Let me just remind our listeners that we are talking to Dr. Zachary Foster, who has a PhD from Princeton University. He's a historian of Palestine. And I'm going to read, Dr. Foster, several emails that I received. Let me start with the Philistines. Good morning. In the Old Testaments, there was a people called the Philistines, whose home was the area now known as Gaza. Are these the same peoples referred to by Dr. Foster? That documentation would precede his reference by 1,000 years. This is Howard from Clearwater. Do you want to answer that, Dr. Foster? And I'll go through the other.
So the Palestinian people have inherited, etymologically speaking, the same root. The same word as the ancient Philistines. So in the ancient world, you have the Philistines. They're living in these 5 coastal cities, what is today the Gaza Strip, essentially. But these Philistines peoples, they're essentially lost in history. And the first time we hear of modern Palestinian, we hear of an Arabic speaker using the term Philistini. This, like I said, is 10th century. Which is that's because the Arab conquerors took the Byzantine districts. So they took the Palestina Prima, the district from Greek and Latin goes into Arabic. But in terms of, if the question is there like blood or connections between the ancient Philistines and the modern Palestinians? No, there not as far as I know. It's an etymological connection, but not a blood connection.
Okay. Again, you can send your questions to dj@wmnf.org. I do have some people on the line. We still have time that we can take these phone calls. But Dr. Foster, of course, everybody is thinking of how could they assassinate him in Iran during supposedly a very heightened security. They are celebrating the inauguration of a new president. And of course, conspiracy theories, I'm going to go through one or two because I don't like to follow them. But again, this is what people are listening online are sending me on Twitter. Like, how could they breach security to that level? And is Iran that vulnerable where they can assassinate foreign visitors? I mean, he's not head of state or anything, but I mean, there is a war going on, and he is one of the political leaders of that group of people engaged in the war. Like, what were they thinking? Doesn't this jeopardize relations or war breaking up very soon?
Well, that's sort of the point, right? The reason for the attack is to increase the chances that there will be another front. The hope is that Iran responds, that Hezbollah responds, that maybe Ansar Allah responds. But the hope is to drag this war on as long as possible.
But Iran is a huge, big country, and they do have people who are maybe strong-willed, more strong-willed than the Hamas fighters, where they don't mind die. And I mean, you were probably very young, but the Iraq-Iran war. These young Iranians would just go into the minefields and die to allow the tanks to pass by. So we're not talking with a little tiny country like Lebanon. 3-4 bombs on Beirut will paralyze the whole country. Iran is a vast country with, I am sure, a huge army. Is Netanyahu that out of his mind to do something like that and jeopardize a war with Iran? Or, if I may say, some people are saying that maybe Iran delivered Ismail Haniyeh to Israel.
Well, obviously, we're all speculating. We don't know if there was a spy, if it was Iran, if Israel had intelligence that he would. Israel. Some rumors I've heard is that that there was a bomb planted in his residence already a few months ago, and they were just waiting for the right moment to attack. Who knows? We're all speculating. I think what we can be more certain of is that Israel has had this longstanding belief that they can disrupt a ceasefire, they can escalate without intending to disrupt or without intending to escalate. They think that the escalation only works one way, that they can escalate without the other side escalating. And this happened, by the way, in 2008. If you recall, on June 19th, 2008, Israel and Hamas signed a ceasefire deal. And it lasted for 4 or 5 months until November 4th, 2008, when Israel broke the ceasefire by entering the Gaza Strip and carrying out a raid that killed 6 Hamas militants. And at the time, Israel was of the belief that, Hamas wants to preserve the ceasefire. Hamas doesn't want to escalate, so they're just going to be okay with that. But of course, Israel was wrong and misguided. You don't get to break the ceasefire but then claim you still want a ceasefire. It doesn't work that way. And I wonder if the same thing is happening now, where Israel thinks that they can preserve this sort of balance of power, this careful kind of tit for tat between itself and Iran and itself and Hezbollah, and at the same time assassinate these leaders in these countries, thinking that they won't respond. I think Israel is of this sort of distorted belief that they're the only ones that are allowed to escalate. And I think that's going to get them in trouble this time.
Okay, let me take some phone calls again. Okay, how do we do this? Oops. Go ahead, you're on True Talk.
Thank you, Samar, for bringing educated historians like last week and now to educate people that do not seek the truth, to see if they can be convinced from hearing the behavior of the colonializer, that they are being exposed, and Netanyahu is so selfish. He is killing everyone in his path to try to keep himself out of prison. Thank you, and I know you are not feeling well, but thank you for pushing through, Samar. Thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate it. Go ahead, you're on True Talk, caller.
Hi, Samar. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for your show. I've learned a lot. It's really fascinating to me to learn that the Palestinians are so entrenched and that their military hasn't been deterred or affected by it. The one thing that I'm confused about, and I'm sorry that I don't really know the answer to, I used to go to conventions. I went to the Army Aviators Convention, and they were American companies that sold products to the military surplus. And so I was always under the impression that our government was in competition with other countries to sell tanks and airplanes and bazookas and bullets, and that it wasn't necessarily the government that was buying and then reselling. The government isn't really the middleman, but the government somehow is just in competition with other countries to sell, military surplus to people that are having, in these internal rebellions or civil wars, whatever you want to call them. But I hear a lot, of people saying, well, it's the government that's giving them these, 200-pound bombs or whatever. And I don't believe that's the case. I think they're giving permission to Americans to sell, that surplus to other countries. But I don't think it's the government per se that's actually doing the selling. And you're going to have that debate, people here in Florida, they have that debate, every election. Do people have the right to buy a gun and defend themselves, or do we restrict people, from buying certain weapons?
Okay.
So I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sorry, Dr. Foster, I didn't know you could not hear the question. The first one was really thanking me because I have a bad cold and I have a very smart person like you on the show, and she also admired Richard, who was on the show last week. The other caller is learning a lot, actually, and I think she has a military background and she goes to these conferences conferences and meetings, and there probably she attends lectures, and she found out that, if I'm not mistaken, that the U.S. government itself sells surplus weapons to Israel, but not only companies like, Lockheed Martin, let's say, or Boeing. No, it's the U.S. government. So could you clarify who is selling weapons really to Israel, and can a company sell Israel weapons without permission from the U.S. government?
That's a good question. So the United States sends Israel $3.8 billion per year in military aid. This is before 2023. Since then, I believe the figure in the past 9 or 10 months or so is somewhere between 10 and 20 billion. So we've dramatically ramped up the amount of arms we are supplying to Israel. But when we say we're supplying arms to Israel, it tends to be the case that Israel is given $3.8 billion and they have to spend it they have to spend it in the United States. The money has to go to weapons manufacturers and arms manufacturers that are U.S.-based companies. Lockheed Martin, Caterpillar, all the usual suspects, right? Boeing, I'm not sure about Boeing, but Hewlett Packard, right? So all of these companies are the benefactors. This was news to me. I was not aware that the United States government was just shipping like U.S. government. Like U.S. military equipment and arms to Israel. That's new information to me. I'm not especially familiar with that. It may well be the case. I mean, we know, for example, just from very interesting reporting over the past couple of weeks, we've had multiple admissions.
Sorry. Especially familiar with that. I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
No.
Sorry.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. Okay.
So we've had multiple admissions from sources that probably leaked this information without realizing they were probably not supposed to. One source claimed that Israel has 5 armored divisions. One of the 5 has lost 2,500 armored vehicles in Gaza, have been either partially or completely destroyed. So multiply that by 5, we're talking about potentially more than 10,000 armored vehicles have been put in disrepair by Hamas fighters. We've also had another admission just a couple of weeks ago that Israel is basically low on tanks. Mm-hmm. Their tanks are all being completely wrecked. And if you watch the Qassam videos that have been coming out every single day for the past 9-10 months, you know this. Right? Hamas has built a weapons industry in Gaza, kind of a native Palestinian arms industry underground, where they're able to, continually build more arms. They built arms that are especially geared for Israeli tanks and Israeli armored personnel carriers and Israeli bulldozers. These weapons are designed to attack Israeli targets. I don't know the exact nature of those of the U.S. weapons agreements, but make no mistake about it. The Israeli military is suffering tremendously right now and is deeply dependent on the United States government for more arms.
Let me remind our listeners, this is True Talk on WMNF. I'm talking to Dr. Zachary Foster, a historian on Palestine. And actually, I got this interesting email. Again, another person that likes the conversation very much. And they're asking about not allowing the U.S. always having a monopoly on negotiations between the Palestinians and Hamas, or the Palestinians and Israel, whether it's Hamas or the Palestinian Authority. For instance, the person is asking about the Chinese, and we know that the Chinese got the Palestinian Authority and representatives of Hamas to meet, and hopefully they will agree on some political platform. Is the U.S. really trying to exercise a monopoly over the any peace negotiations between the Palestinians and the Israelis? Won't allow Europeans, won't allow Latin Americans, won't allow Chinese, and won't allow Russians?
The United States has long attempted to monopolize the role of mediator in Israel-Palestine, right? This was the approach from the late 80s onwards. This is going back even to the Carter years when you had brokered agreements between Israel and Egypt, right? This has been longstanding U.S. policy is, we're the global superpower, we're the global policeman, we're going to broker these agreements. The problem, of course, has been that the United States is not an impartial third party. The United States acts as Israel's lawyer. The United States defends Israel to UN. The United States vetoes resolutions critical of Israel to UN. The United States arms Israel. The United States provides Israel with a qualitative military edge. That's official U.S. policy for decades. So I think that's part of the reason why China has increasingly, over the past a decade, played an increasingly important role in the Middle East. Right? We saw them broker Iran Saudi Arabia agreement. We see China very active now with as you said, between the Palestinian factions, brokering this this deal between Abbas and Hamas. So it's clear, and China is all over the Middle East. They have bases in Syria. They have bases in, they're clearly interested in playing a more important role in the Middle East and elsewhere around the world. And I think, we're kind of beginning to see the end of U.S. hegemony and the emergence of a multipolar world where it's not just the U.S., but it's the U.S., it's China, it's Russia, it's India, it's the BRICS. It's a host of countries that can exert regional power rather than just having a single global hegemon.
And online, I do have a question, Dr. Foster, about the two-state solution, that the U.S. is still talking about the two-state solution. People who are much more aware of the makeup of this territory. Okay, you call it Israel, we call it Palestine, the occupied territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, Golan Heights, North, South, East. Some people say it is impossible to have a two-state solution. The U.S. is still talking about a two-state solution. What do you think, personally, as somebody who studied that part of the world, your personal opinion? Should we all pursue a two-state solution, that it is easier, that could be a stepping stone to maybe a more, I don't know how, but anyways, a better solution to the conflict? Or you have another idea of what could be done to end this problem?
The two-state solution, as it's known, should be better called a one-state apartheid reality, because we can talk about however many states we want in the future. We can talk about what we hope to believe will happen in 25 years from now, but it's a fiction. It has been a fiction for decades now. There is no. It's so insidious to even talk about a two-state solution, because it's the same people who talk about a two-state solution that support apartheid. It should just be called, we believe in permanent Israeli apartheid. There's only one state between the river and the sea. That is the state of Israel. There's only one prime minister between the river and the sea. There's only one cabinet. There's only one Knesset. There's only one legislative body. There's only one Supreme Court. But there are there are different categories of people who have different rights. There are 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank who do not have a citizenship for the government that controls their lives. They do not have the right to vote for the government that controls their lives. They do not have freedom of movement. And they never will, because Israel will never give up the West Bank. Israel will never give Palestinians real sovereignty in the West Bank or Gaza. Israel will never come up with a just solution to the refugee problem, because that would undermine its Jewish majority. So what we're left with is a government that, for 75, 80% of its history as a government, it continues to control and dominate and expand its control and expand its domination of Gaza and the West Bank, right? If you look at Israeli occupation infrastructure, roads, settlements, military bases, land confiscations, destruction of Palestinian property, if you plotted it out on a graph, it goes in one direction. It never goes in the other direction. It's up and to the right. More settlements, more Israeli-only roads, more destruction of Palestinian property, more confiscation of Palestinian property, more Israeli
I think
military,
even water politics.
More domination of the water. You're exactly right. Even in the Oslo Accords, when Palestinians were supposed to have some nominal control over their own water, we've seen Israel take more Palestinian water since those accords were signed in 93 and 95 and 97. So it's basically like, if you look at the graph again, it's going in one direction, which means Israel, which means the West Bank and Gaza, have been and continue to be and will only be a permanent part of Israel. That's just a fact. It doesn't matter whether you and I like that fact. Obviously, we don't like that fact, but that is a fact. So in a world where Gaza and the West Bank are a permanent part of Israel, but there are different rights for Palestinians as there are for Israelis in those territories, well, you're left with an apartheid state. And that's why the two-state solution is a fantasy.
And it's not sustainable, I think, to have this type of an apartheid state. It cannot be sustained, can it? Can it go on? Because the human nature of a person is to have water, to travel, to marry. Like if you are in East Jerusalem, you can't marry somebody from West Bank, and you are just like, 15 minutes car drive.
If you're in Anata, which is an area, if you could literally be on the other side of an invisible line, and you can't marry, right? I mean, you're literally talking about neighbors, people belonging to the same family.
Sorry, I don't know how time flew by, but I want to really thank you, Zakaria. I call you, pronounce your name in the Arabic way, Zakaria, but it's Zachary Foster, PhD from Princeton, historian of Palestine. I really appreciate you taking the time to be on True Talk.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, our listeners, for supporting WMNF, and thank you for always supporting True Talk. I promise you, inshallah, God willing, that next week Ahmed and I will be on True Talk, maybe in the studio. My friend Ahmed is back in town, but he also has a very terrible bronchitis the way I do. Mine should be better, but thank you again for listening, and thank you, Zach Foster. This is True Talk on WMNF 88.5 FM. WMNF Tampa. The Scoop is next.